Another question is sort of along the same lines, which is you've talked about how you see there's a tipping point, you say, and that there are some countries like the US and the UK which may be slowly be more willing to tell Kagame that he's approaching or has stepped over the red line. Do you think that views are changing in Africa as well, on the continent and within the African Union, about Rwanda and the way Kagame runs the country?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it would depend which kind of Africans you talk to. I mean, one of Kagame's very canny moves has been to turn Kigali into a very successful international conference hub. And so you had the African Union meeting there, the African Development Bank meeting there, Davos in Africa was staged there. And you know, the feedback I get from people who are invited to those conferences is that African delegates who are either, you know, ministers or ministry officials or politicians all sort of get into the bus and sort of are immediately impressed. There's Wi-Fi on the bus, and they drive down these smoothly tarmac roads. Rwanda's always had smoothly tarmac roads. Then they get to these plush hotels with Wi-Fi in their rooms, and then they go into this sort of multicolored, you know, brightly lit convention center, and they all sort of come away going, we need to do this in our own country, and rather ignoring the price that ordinary Rwandan citizens have paid for that. And I've certainly seen, you know, in Ghanaian papers, for example, people saying we need to be more like Rwanda, because after all, people are looking at Rwanda and thinking, so this is a really you know, quite a hardline African government. It doesn't show any compunction about you know, crushing the opposition and keeping the free press under its heel. And it's doing all these things we're told not to do, but it's getting all this foreign aid. So what's not to like? If the Rwandans can do it, well, surely we can too. So I think a lot of that kind of clique, that elite clique, see it as a wonderful model to be emulated. But you know, what does an ordinary Ghanaian think of that kind of rationalization? I dread to think. I think it was fairly clear that Magufuli of Tanzania, who of course died quite recently, he sort of modelled himself on Kagame. You know, he was sort of very in your face, and you know, he was very proud of his sort of. He was going to have some certain strong arm tactics, no apologies, tell the West to take a running hike whenever ambassadors objected to various policies that he unveiled. And I think this is one of the dangers with these forms of regime, that people model behavior, you know, governments and leaders model their behavior on what they see other regimes getting away with. And you can see the echoes, and you can see the way in which people are sort of thinking, oh, okay, they got away with that. Well, we can do something similar. So yeah, yeah. There's a mirroring and an echoing going on.
Well, yes, and if Kagame's responses to the suggestion that there be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the region is anything to go by, then I think you're spot on, that there just won't be any space given to that idea. We have a really good question here, which is, to what extent is Kagame acting alone? As the death of Mugabe has shown, these kinds of, you know, the leaders, iconic leaders leaving the scene don't necessarily change the governance dynamics, and they haven't done in Zimbabwe, for example. So what do you think? I mean, how much of this is Kagame? How much of it is a system? And then I think linked to that, and that might be our last question, depending on how long you take to answer, is how might all of this end? The $1 million question.
That's always the easy one. Yeah, I think Kagame's definitely a more isolated figure than he used to be, partly because his closest advisors, and I think the people who were probably giving him good advice, have gone. You know, they're all in exile. He's tried to kill them all. So you get Théogène Rudasingwa, his former chef de cabinet, who is living in Washington, who there have been repeated, well-documented attempts to take him out. Patrick Karegeya, former head of, also his consigliere, dead. You know, Kayumba, head of his armed forces, repeatedly targeted for assassination. Gérard Gahima, former Solicitor General, also living in Washington in exile. So he's lost a lot of good brains and the kind of people who would have who formed a kind of phalanx around him. And it was a critical phalanx, but it was a loyal phalanx. And I think what you see is that there's an endless churn in which the generals below him are constantly being moved, ministers are constantly being sacked, replaced. And so there's a deliberate kind of keep people moving, prevent them establishing their own fiefdoms, prevent them gathering people around themselves who might challenge the big man, and that means he's quite isolated. And you end up thinking, well, who is there? Because so many of the key names that have been associated with him over the years will go through a ritual humiliation, a sacking, or they'll be given an ambassador's post to some obscure capital as far away from Kigali as you can imagine. So I think he is actually really isolated. But to the last question of what happens next, I think there's never any point taking bets on what happens in the Great Lakes. I mean, if you look over the last few years, just over, I think it's the last year, we've seen Magufuli dying in Tanzania, and everything suddenly changing in Tanzania. And we saw Nkurunziza dropping dead, very young man still, in Burundi, and rigged elections then producing a new leader in DRC who is now defying all expectations and proving somewhat more feisty than people expected. And so I think it's never a good idea to take long-term bets. But one of the reasons I'm so critical of Kagame and of Western policy towards Rwanda is it seems to me completely unsustainable, because there is no smooth succession possible if you've got a system that is as personalized as what we've seen. If you have a system in which systematically every possible successor or deputy has been sidelined, has fled into exile, lives in fear of his life, and that's been the policy, then you won't have any successors lined up. So if Kagame were to suddenly die of a brain tumor, and there, for example, were rumors exactly to that effect this last year, because he disappeared for a couple of months, and the word was that he died on the operating table of a brain tumor, I guess we would see a general taking over. But it's really not clear, and it certainly wouldn't be a smooth and harmonious transition. I'm interested in his family. I noticed that in a recent interview he gave to Jeune Afrique, he talks about Rwanda not being a monarchy. I haven't yet had a chance to read it. But I think events in Chad recently, when Idris Deby very suddenly and unexpectedly died, and then the son took over, does make me wonder if we might see something like that happening in Rwanda, because it seems to me that the daughter Ange Kagame, smart woman, working in the president's office, a lot of these presidents do end up turning to members of their family, because the members of the family are the only people they trust not to betray them. So I do sometimes wonder if we might see a sort of Idris Deby type succession in Rwanda if something very sudden were to happen. But all bets are off, I reckon.